I'm here at the European Development Days in Brussels, and with me is Olivier Consolo, the Director of CONCORD. Thank you very much for being here.
Thank you.
Olivier, tell me, the European NGO market, is it in a crisis right now as development agencies are cutting back or at least considering aid cuts?
So in financial terms, of course, when there is a financial crisis, as it is the case in Europe, where ODA budgets are cut, not everywhere, but in most of the countries in Europe, of course there is an impact for the business model of NGOs, especially in countries where most or big part of the resources for NGOs were coming from their national bilateral aid. But I think, on the other hand, European NGOs are much stronger than 10 years ago in many aspects, in terms of legitimacy, in terms of self-confidence, and in terms of understanding their role in this global world. So, depending where you take your question, which is a financial situation or a more political stand for the sector, I think the answer might be nuanced.
What types of NGOs, maybe in what countries, what sectors, are in particular danger right now, or at least have a particularly large incentive to change?
To change, we try to be actor of change, and we should never forget that this implies to change ourselves and to evolve with our times and the new challenges ahead. But here it's more defensive change because it's imposed by external stakeholders, partners for ever, like in the Netherlands, the government has been supporting the sector, Dutch NGOs, which are now struggling with radical cuts, no time to adapt. The timing of the change is also very important, the time you have to adapt to the new situation. So in Spain, another example for NGOs, the situation is so difficult. They were back on track regarding ODA. NGOs were playing a very important role with the bilateral donors in the country, and local donors also, decentralized aid as we call it, cooperation. And now, from one day to another, the ODA level of Spain are back to the 80s levels, which is even before they're coming in the European Union. So this is absolutely unmanageable for a sector, for any organization, private sector organization, non-for-profit including.
So what are those Spanish NGOs then doing?
They are trying to keep at least very strongly connected with their public, national general public, because we should never forget that more than half of European NGO resources are coming from the general public, and the general public has been maintaining across Europe and also in some crisis country a reasonable and good support to NGOs. So they understand that in time of crisis is then when you need more to show solidarity with also for foreign countries and developing countries which are also facing crisis in a way or another. So you need to be back to your roots, which is in society, the people that support you. And you need to certainly, as a Spanish NGO, back to your question, look at what Europe can provide. European aid today has maintained and might even increase slightly some support to NGOs in the future. So we hope that this might be also a kind of help for Spanish NGOs, and they will need to reinvent their business model. And again, we hope that Spain, after a period of few years, might also go back on track in terms of ODA levels.
You mentioned business model. What would you recommend to an NGO that is facing financial troubles right now? How should they adapt their business model? What are some of the ideas, some of the options on the table that have proven successful to at least some NGOs here in Europe?
And I'm not feeling very competent in very specific terms about your question, but in general terms we could say that the diversity of supporters, donors and funding is certainly one of the key for resilience. On the other hand, I think for big NGOs it might be something to think about being less big without losing space and power and capacity. I mean, I think there is ways of being a little bit more middle-sized and still keeping the profile and the legitimacy some big organization has built for decades. the big multinationals, NGOs might change their nature in the future. That's something they should address themselves first, and they have the means to do it. The real tricky situation is for the middle-sized NGOs. I think they are, more dependent on the short-term resources they mobilize, and for them, inventing a new business model would request new investment or new funding. It's a paradox, but to reinvent yourself, you need also some investment within the structure, within the strategy. So I think the middle NGO should be the one we look at more carefully, and with institution, we should look at how to support that core of our sector, which is in numbers also the core of the sector.
Some people say that the NGO sector will change drastically and perhaps permanently in a way where you have some of the large, traditionally big international NGOs, Save the Children, CARE, those will remain. And then you have small local ones which will function as the local partners. And then, the middle is squeezed and might have to either choose some sort of niche cause or just really try to find another way to survive. What do you think about that?
Now, this is not just due to the crisis. This is an ongoing discussion. I've heard about it for 1 decade at least, the kind of strategy of networking among medium-sized organizations within Europe to create some European federation, that kind of tool that can help also to divide competencies, skills among a broader network. So I think there is already some experience and intent. But again, I think there is not one recipe. I'm not sure that all the big NGOs will remain better than the others. I think it will go across a little bit, depending on what is beyond the business model. I think more importantly is the strategy that each organization can develop for the next 10 years in really redefining the role in society, in our society first. I think this is the main important things. We might be overseas and working with faraway countries and partners, but we are genuine civil society from Europe, in Europe. And these roots are the most important if we want to last more time.
So it's sort of a dual focus almost. You want to stay local, but you also need to have a presence where you're from.
I think to do good work wherever, you need to understand your own environment. And our southern partners, global partners, are really demanding or requesting our sector to be able to connect with European reality. The whole divide between developing countries and rich country or OECD countries is almost old-fashioned. The challenges the world is facing are globals, are international, including our big Europe. The sustainable development agenda might call us to rethink the way we see our own economical and social models. So in a way, this old divide is not very pertinent. So for development NGOs, traditional European or Northern European NGOs, it's more than the crisis. I think this new reality will imply to reinvent ourselves, reconnecting much more with our social, political actors in Europe.
And you mentioned the sustainable development. Right now, of course, there is a whole bunch of talk about follow-up targets to the Millennium Development Goals, and many people are calling for global sustainable development goals. How is that discussion going to affect the NGO community, you think?
So civil society are very active. We have been quite proactive indeed regarding this agenda, setting an international campaign calling Beyond 2015 already more than 1 year ago. The GCAP campaign, which was the campaign around the MDGs called Global Call for Action Against Poverty, is also engaging in it. Civicus, just to talk about global actors. But all those alliances are remobilizing their troops and constituency to be ready for that post-MDG agenda. And within that, for the moment, and in Concord it's very clear, the official position is to say we must think about a post-MDG agenda which include all the countries, and to stop this divide between donor countries and recipient developing countries. We need a development framework that works for all countries to make possible to live in this planet with 9 billion inhabitants tomorrow in a way which is affordable for everybody, acceptable for everybody, that meets the minimum standards of human rights and for all. So this is really officially the trend. So we are not yet talking about the kind of SDG agenda becoming the post-MDG, but certainly the two processes led by the UN Intergovernmental and UN strictly will need to come together, as the head of the UN, the Secretary General, is calling for. I think member states, countries are not yet ready for that, but that might be the logic.
Mm-hmm. And since we're here in Brussels, I want to ask you about EuropeAid as well. Obviously, as Europe is going through financial calamities, as you said, a lot of NGOs are looking to Brussels for funding, for support. That means opportunities, but also competition. What are some of the challenges that NGOs face right now in partnering with EuropeAid, and what are some of the new opportunities you see coming?
I would like just to clarify one thing, which is if NGOs are strongly mobilizing resources and capacity to work at EU level, it's firstly not for finance funding questions. It's for the importance we see in the European institution as political actors in setting some international agenda. And this has been very clearly shown through some survey we did with our wide constituency. Only 10% of European NGO funding is coming from Europe. That's not the major reason why we work in Europe. It's more advocacy, it's more public awareness, it's more institutional engagement with the EU institution. That's our primary role and reason to be in Europe and in Brussels. Now back to your question, what we see also in our relation with EuropeAid when it's back to funding is the difficulty for NGOs, and again middle-sized, small NGOs, to access EU funding. Not to blame the Commission, but perhaps the broader EU institutions, but the set of conditions to access EU funding is so complex, requires so much expertise just to write, application that might be considered by the EU institutions that excludes small and medium-sized organizations, even if they do excellent work on the ground. So this is a permanent discussion with the EU, how to make these rules more accessible, less bureaucratic, less administrative, creating administrative burden on the side of CSOs. We must use our limited resources better than just mobilizing to write applications. So that's, and the Commission acknowledged that, and we try to engage in simplifying the rules to access funding and to run funding. Now we have another issue, which is for EU institutions which have limited their own human resources for the last decades because of the pressure of member states to increase the scope of competencies and policies of the EU, but to limit the cost of it. They are also facing, in the institution and the Commission, their own struggle in terms of capacity. So to deal with a lot of small granting with NGOs is really a burden for the EU institution. So how to imagine some sub-granting scheme that would allow perhaps the Commission to provide resources in one slot, important resources, to a sector that will then trickle down to more small local actors. This is another issue we are trying to look at, because it's really important to allow small organizations or medium-sized organizations to access EU funding. But again, I insist, this is not the main purpose of our presence in Europe level.
What are some of the reforms that you are pushing right now with Europe, especially on EuropeAid, of course, as it works with civil society if you had to tell us 3, 4, or 5 of your main requests right now, what would those be?
Well, one is to encourage the European Commission and European institutions to go on in their increasing acknowledgement of the importance of civil society organization in development, but more broadly in society changes. And this has been acknowledged a few weeks ago by a EC communication on CSO role as development actors, which is, from our perspective, one of the best paper that has been written by institutions on this subject. So now this needs to go back to EU delegation in country, because what is important is to make sure that Europe engage with local, national, civil society organization, leadership, agent of change in country to pursue the goals of this big framework of development. You need societies that move, that play their role at local level. So that's one big issue. The other one, which is very political, which is the so-called policy coherence for development. CONCORD has been pushing since the Finnish presidency, EU presidency 2005, if I remember well, this agenda for more coherence among broader policy scope, not just development cooperation, but to look at agriculture policy, fisheries, migration, and trade, of course, many others, to see and to assess their impact in pushing for development outcomes, which are mainly linked to poverty eradication and fight against inequalities. So if you look at that agenda, there is work for the next 20 years, and CONCORD is very vocal and trying to convince also actors that this is the new priority beyond the traditional aid framework.
And what do you think will be the successes that you will achieve first? You've talked about a whole bunch of things that will probably take years to implement.
But it starts well. For example, on biofuels, there is a CONCORD activity tomorrow that will focus on this so important question. You know, perhaps that a few years ago the EU, with a good intention, I guess, initially pushed for 20% of agrofuel or biofuels into our cars and in our economy in Europe, but with very negative secondary effect in developing countries, competition between land for food and land for biofuels. Well, this is discussed today, and already the EU, under this PCD Lisbon Treaty provision, so it's a very enforceable obligation of European institutions to look at that seriously, are already adapting their own policy to make this more compatible and to avoid the negative impact. So we see some positive developments. Just to give one example, in the CAP reform, the Common Agriculture Policy, we managed to get at least in the kind of risk assessment that the EU is supposed to do for any policy, to look at the impact in developing world, which was never the case in the past. On energy, we see also some good initiatives. So I think it's progressing relatively good. But we know that this will last for a long, long time, because they are very complex processes that imply actors which are the core of the economical business model of Europe in that case. But that's our responsibility also to challenge that model. And our partners in the South request and demand on us to be strong, vocal, to show evidences when it doesn't work, when it works as well, of course, to challenge that way of doing incoherence policies.
Well, we'll keep watching, that's for sure. And thank you very much for being here.
Thank you. It's a pleasure.
And thank you very much for watching. Stay tuned to Devex.